John Emil List turned off all the lights in his 18-room mansion in Westfield, New Jersey on November 9, 1971, except for those illuminating the ballroom on the third floor. Inside that ballroom, laid out in sleeping bags on the floor, were the bodies of his entire family: his wife Helen, his mother Alma, and his 3 children Patricia, John Jr., and Frederick. John had spent the morning systematically executing each member of his family with a 9mm handgun, shooting his mother in the head while she ate breakfast, then waiting for his children to come home from school one by one, and killing them as they entered the house. His wife Helen had been the first to die, shot multiple times in the kitchen while making breakfast. After arranging the bodies in the ballroom and placing them in sleeping bags, John wrote a 5-page letter to his pastor, explaining why he had been forced to kill his family: financial ruin, religious conviction, and the belief that his wife and children were leading sinful lives that would condemn them to hell. Then John List walked out of his mansion, drove to the airport, and disappeared. For 18 years he lived under an assumed name, remarried, attended church regularly, and maintained a completely normal life, while his family's bodies lay undiscovered for nearly a month in that ballroom. He was finally captured in 1989, after America's Most Wanted aired a segment about the case featuring a forensic sculptor's age-progressed bust, showing what List would look like after 18 years. A viewer in Virginia recognized him immediately. He was living as Robert Clark, working as an accountant, and had never shown a hint of remorse for what he had done. His trial in 1990 would shock the nation, as List gave detailed confessions about how and why he murdered his family, showing no emotion, no tears, no regret, only cold, calculated explanations, rooted in twisted religious logic and financial desperation. He was sentenced to 5 consecutive life terms and died in prison in 2008 at age 82. Having spent the last 18 years of his life behind bars for the murders he committed in what he called an act of mercy. If you're watching this video, please take a moment to hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments where you're listening from. Your support helps us continue bringing these important stories to light. John Emil List was born on September 17, 1925, in Bay City, Michigan, the only child of John Frederick List and Alma Barbara Florence List. His father was a machinist who worked in a factory, and his mother Alma was a deeply religious woman who attended services at the local Lutheran church multiple times per week and raised John in an atmosphere of strict religious discipline and moral rigidity. The List household was not a warm or affectionate place. Alma was controlling and judgmental, constantly monitoring John's behavior and enforcing strict rules about everything from how he dressed to whom he could associate with. John's father was passive and distant, working long hours and deferring to Alma on all matters concerning their son's upbringing. From an early age, John was taught that the world was a sinful place full of temptation, and that only through strict adherence to religious doctrine could one avoid eternal damnation. Alma insisted that John attend church services every Sunday, participate in Bible study classes, and avoid any activities or friendships that might lead him astray from the path of righteousness. She was particularly obsessive about money and financial security, having lived through the Great Depression and developed a deep fear of poverty. She taught John that financial irresponsibility was not just foolish, but morally wrong, a sin against God that demonstrated a lack of faith and discipline. John was a quiet, obedient child who never rebelled against his mother's strict rules. He was socially awkward and had few friends, spending most of his time studying or helping around the house. He excelled academically, particularly in mathematics and accounting, subjects that appealed to his orderly, methodical mind. After graduating from high school in 1943, John enlisted in the U.S. Army during World War II, serving as a laboratory technician. The military provided structure and clear expectations, and John thrived in this environment. He was promoted to sergeant and received an honorable discharge in 1946. After the war, John used the GI Bill to attend the University of Michigan, where he studied business administration and accounting. He graduated in 1950 and began working as an accountant, a profession that suited his personality perfectly. It was detail-oriented, rule-based, and removed from the messy, emotional complexities of human relationships. John was good at his job, meticulous and reliable, though his colleagues found him odd and overly formal. He had no social life to speak of, spending his evenings and weekends at home with his mother, who had moved to New Jersey to be closer to him. In 1951, at age 26, John met Helen Morris Taylor at a church social event. Helen was a widow 9 years older than John, with a daughter named Brenda from her first marriage. Helen had been married to an Army officer who died in combat during World War II, leaving her to raise Brenda alone. She was attracted to John's stability and his apparent devotion to his Christian faith. John was attracted to Helen because she seemed kind, and because marrying her would allow him to escape his mother's domineering presence. Or so he thought. John and Helen married in December 1951. Almost immediately, problems emerged. Alma was furious that her son had married without consulting her, and that he had chosen a woman with a child from a previous marriage. She made her disapproval clear at every opportunity, criticizing Helen's housekeeping, her parenting, her cooking, everything. John, rather than defending his wife or setting boundaries with his mother, remained passive and allowed Alma to continue her criticism unabated. Helen herself was not the docile, submissive wife John had hoped for. She had opinions and expectations. She wanted to live in a nice house, to have nice things, to enjoy life rather than simply endure it in somber religious observance. And critically, Helen suffered from a medical condition, syphilis, that she had contracted from her first husband during his military service. The disease had advanced to a tertiary stage by the time she met John, causing neurological damage that manifested in erratic behavior, mood swings, and eventually symptoms resembling mental illness. John was horrified when he learned of Helen's condition after their marriage, seeing it as evidence of sin and moral corruption, even though Helen was an innocent victim of her late husband's infidelity. Despite these problems, John and Helen had 3 children together: Patricia Ann, born in 1955, John Frederick Jr., born in 1957, and Frederick Michael, born in 1958. John took his role as father seriously, providing for his family financially and ensuring they attended church regularly. But he was a cold, distant father who showed little affection and related to his children primarily through rigid rules and expectations. Patricia, the oldest, was a bright and artistic girl who loved theater and drama. John Jr. was athletic and popular, playing soccer and hanging out with friends. Frederick was the quietest of the 3, more academic and introverted. All 3 children sensed their father's disapproval of anything that smacked of frivolity or fun, and they learned to keep their true selves hidden from him. The 1960s were a difficult decade for the List family. John worked as an accountant at various firms in New Jersey, but had trouble keeping jobs. Despite his technical competence, his odd personality and inability to work well with others led to conflicts with supervisors and colleagues. He was fired from several positions for being inflexible, argumentative, and resistant to change. Each job loss was a humiliation for John, who saw his professional failures as evidence that the world was corrupt and that people who didn't share his values were conspiring against him. In 1965, John accepted a position as vice president and comptroller at a bank in Jersey City. The job came with a substantial salary, over $30,000 per year, equivalent to about $280,000 in today's dollars. For the first time in his life, John had real financial security and status. He decided to purchase a home befitting his new position, and in 1966 he bought a massive Victorian mansion called Breeze Knoll in Westfield, New Jersey, for $50,000. The house was an architectural marvel: 3 stories, 18 rooms, a ballroom on the 3rd floor with a Tiffany stained glass skylight worth over $100,000, and extensive grounds. It was far more house than the List family needed, but John saw it as a statement of his success and a place where his family could live in accordance with proper Christian values. But the purchase of Breeze Knoll was the beginning of John List's downfall. The mansion required extensive maintenance and repairs that John couldn't afford. The heating costs alone were astronomical. over $1,000 per month in the winter, a crippling expense. Property taxes were high, and within a year of purchasing the house, John lost his job at the bank. He was demoted first, then fired entirely for poor performance and conflicts with management. Suddenly, John had no income, massive expenses, and a family depending on him. What John did next would define the trajectory that led to murder. He lied. He didn't tell Helen or his children that he had lost his job. Instead, he got up every morning, put on his suit and tie, and pretended to go to work. In reality, he spent his days at the local library, reading newspapers and job listings, or sitting in his car in parking lots, waiting for enough time to pass that he could return home without raising suspicion. He took out a second mortgage on Breeze Knoll. He borrowed money from his mother, who had moved into the mansion with the family. He stopped paying bills, the utilities, the property taxes, the mortgage. Collection notices piled up, which John hid from his family. For over a year, John maintained this charade, all while the financial situation grew more desperate. He applied for jobs but couldn't find anything that paid enough to cover the mansion's expenses. His unemployment benefits ran out. His savings were depleted. The bank began foreclosure proceedings on Breeze Knoll. John's mother, Alma, became suspicious and confronted him about money, and John admitted he had lost his job. Alma was furious and disappointed, seeing John's failures as evidence of moral weakness. She began making plans to move out and take her money with her, which would leave John completely destitute. By the fall of 1971, John List was desperate and cornered. He couldn't afford to keep the mansion. He couldn't pay the bills. He couldn't support his family. And in his twisted religious worldview, he saw only one solution. He had to kill his family before they were destroyed by the sinful world he could no longer protect them from. John rationalized that his wife's illness was making her behave sinfully, that his children were being corrupted by the secular culture of the 1970s. His daughter Patricia was involved in theater and wore makeup, which John saw as vanity and worldliness. His sons wanted to play sports and have normal social lives, which John saw as distractions from religious devotion. In John's mind, if he killed his family, they would die in a state of grace and go to heaven. If he allowed them to continue living, they would be corrupted by sin and go to hell. The choice, to him, was clear. John began planning the murders in October 1971. He purchased a 9mm handgun and ammunition. He drafted a confession letter to his pastor, explaining his reasoning. He made lists of tasks to complete after the murders, canceling newspaper and milk deliveries, notifying schools that the children would be absent. He chose November 9, 1971, as the date because it was the day after his daughter Patricia's 16th birthday. He didn't want to kill her on her birthday. On the morning of November 9, 1971, John List woke up early and ate breakfast alone in the kitchen of Breeze Knoll. His plan was set. There would be no turning back. At approximately 9 a.m., his wife Helen came downstairs in her nightgown and began making coffee. John retrieved the 9mm handgun from where he had hidden it in his desk drawer, walked into the kitchen, and shot Helen once in the head from behind. She collapsed immediately, dying instantly. John stood over her body for several moments, feeling nothing. No grief, no horror, no horror, no remorse. Just a sense of grim determination that he was doing what needed to be done. John's mother, Alma, was upstairs in her third-floor apartment, which occupied part of the ballroom level. John climbed the stairs and entered her apartment. Alma was eating breakfast at her small kitchen table. John shot her once in the head. She died instantly, her body slumping forward onto the table. John left her there and returned downstairs to wait for his children to come home from school. Patricia, 16, arrived home first at approximately noon. She had attended morning classes and come home for lunch as she often did. John met her at the door and shot her in the head as she entered the house. She died instantly and fell in the hallway. John dragged her body into the ballroom on the third floor. John Jr., 13, and Frederick, 15, arrived home together at approximately 3:30 p.m. after soccer practice. John called to them as they entered, asking them to come upstairs to help him with something. As each boy reached the top of the stairs, John shot him in the back of the head. Both boys died instantly. John dragged their bodies to the ballroom and laid them next to their mother and sister. By 4 p.m., John's entire family was dead. The house was quiet. John spent the next several hours methodically completing the tasks on his list. He placed each body in a sleeping bag and arranged them carefully in the ballroom. He placed his mother's body in a separate area of the ballroom, away from Helen and the children. Even in death, Alma remained apart from the family she had despised. John turned on all the lights in the ballroom so the bodies would be clearly visible when someone eventually entered. He turned off all other lights in the house. John went to his desk and retrieved the 5-page letter he had written to his pastor, Reverend Eugene Raywinkle, of the Redeemer Lutheran Church. The letter explained in detail why he had killed his family. John wrote, "I know that what I have done is wrong, but I had to do it. Helen's sickness had gotten to the point where she was contemplating leaving the church. I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't let the children see their mother reject God. And I couldn't let them grow up in a world that would corrupt them. The children were beginning to stray from the church. Patricia was involved in theater, which was encouraging her to become vain and worldly. The boys wanted to play sports all the time instead of focusing on their studies and their faith. I had to save them from damnation. Now they are with God. They died before they could be corrupted beyond redemption. I did what I had to do. I am a coward because I cannot face what I have done. I cannot face the family members and friends who will not understand. So I am leaving. I ask God to forgive me and to care for my family in heaven." John placed the letter on his desk where it would be found. He canceled the newspaper delivery by phone, claiming the family was going on an extended trip. He stopped the milk delivery. He wrote notes to the children's schools, saying they would be absent for several weeks due to a family emergency. He cleaned the kitchen, washing the dishes and wiping down the counters. He made sure all the doors were locked. At approximately 8 p.m., John List walked out of Breeze Knoll for the last time. He got into the family's 1963 Chevrolet Impala and drove to John F. Kennedy Airport in New York. He parked the car in the long-term parking lot, took his suitcase, and disappeared into the night. He had taken his mother's life savings, approximately $200,000 in cash and bonds, which he had been managing for her. He left no forwarding address, no trail, no clues to where he was going. The bodies of Helen, Alma, Patricia, John Jr., and Frederick List remained in the ballroom of Breeze Knoll for nearly a month. Neighbors noticed that all the lights in the mansion were on constantly, day and night, but assumed the family was simply keeping them on while they were away. Eventually, light bulbs began to burn out one by one, and the house grew dark. The accumulation of mail in the mailbox, the overgrown lawn, and the complete lack of activity around the property finally prompted neighbors to call police. On December 7, 1971, exactly 1 month after the murders, Westfield police entered Breeze Knoll through an unlocked window. The house was freezing cold. The heat had been turned off, which had helped preserve the bodies but also meant the entire mansion had taken on the character of a tomb. Officers found the bodies in the ballroom, exactly as John had arranged them. Decomposed but still recognizable. The Tiffany skylight above them cast colored light through the dark ballroom in an eerie, almost sacred display. The discovery of 5 bodies in one of Westfield's most prominent homes shocked the affluent community and made national headlines. Police immediately identified John List as the primary suspect, but he had vanished without a trace. A massive manhunt was launched. The FBI was brought in. John's photograph was distributed to law enforcement agencies across the country. But John List had planned his disappearance carefully, and no one had any idea where he had gone. The investigation revealed the extent of John's financial collapse and the methodical planning that had preceded the murders. Police found his confession letter, which explained his twisted religious motivations. They found evidence that John had been unemployed for over a year and had hidden it from his family. They found unpaid bills, foreclosure notices, and evidence that John had systematically isolated himself and his family from friends and extended family members who might have offered help. The portrait that emerged was of a man who, faced with failure and humiliation, had chosen to murder his family rather than admit he couldn't provide for them. Helen List was buried in Fairview Cemetery in Westfield, along with her 3 children, in a single funeral attended by hundreds of mourners. Alma List's body was sent back to Michigan to be buried with her husband. The community of Westfield was traumatized by the murders, struggling to understand how such a thing could happen in their quiet, affluent town. Breeze Knoll remained empty after the murders. In August 1972, less than a year after the murders, the mansion burned to the ground in a fire that was officially ruled as arson, though no suspect was ever identified. Many speculated that someone had set the fire intentionally to destroy what had become a site of horror. The Tiffany skylight, valued at over $100,000, was destroyed in the fire. A new house was eventually built on the property. For 18 years, John List lived as a free man while authorities searched for him without success.
All photographs of John had been destroyed. He had taken them with him, or they had been lost in the fire that consumed Breeze Knoll, leaving investigators with only physical descriptions to work from. John had chosen his hiding place wisely. He moved to Denver, Colorado, and assumed a new identity as Robert Peter Clark. He obtained a Social Security number using forged documents, got a driver's license under his new name, and found work as an accountant. As Robert Clark, John lived a quiet, unremarkable life. He rented an apartment, worked his accounting job competently, if not brilliantly, and attended services at a Lutheran church every Sunday just as he had done all his life. In 1975, he met Dolores Miller at a church social event. Dolores was a widow who worked as a secretary. She found Bob Clark to be a kind, if somewhat odd and formal, man who shared her religious values. They began dating and married in 1977, 6 years after John had murdered his first family. Dolores had no idea she was married to a fugitive killer. Bob told her he had been married before, and that his wife and children had died in a car accident, which explained why he never wanted to talk about his past, and why he had no contact with any family members. Dolores accepted this explanation, and never questioned it. They lived together as a normal married couple, attending church, socializing with other church members, celebrating holidays. John was a distant but non-abusive husband. He worked, paid the bills, maintained a facade of normalcy. He never showed any signs of violence or the inner turmoil that had led him to murder. It was as if John List had completely compartmentalized what he had done and simply moved on with his life as a different person. But John List's luck was about to run out. In 1989, the producers of America's Most Wanted decided to feature the List case on their popular television program.
The show had gained a reputation for helping capture fugitives through tips from viewers, and the List case, a family annihilator who had escaped justice for 18 years, was exactly the kind of story that would captivate their audience. The challenge was that there were no photographs of John List. The producers worked with forensic sculptor Frank Bender to create a bust, showing what List would likely look like after 18 years on the run. Bender studied the old physical descriptions of List, factored in aging patterns, and created a clay sculpture that showed a middle-aged man with a receding hairline, jowly features, and wearing thick-framed glasses. The bust was remarkably accurate. Bender had essentially predicted what John List would look like in 1989, based on what he had looked like in 1971. The America's Most Wanted episode about the List case aired on May 21, 1989. Within days, the show received hundreds of tips from viewers who thought they recognized John List. One tip came from Wanda Flannery, a former neighbor of Robert Clark in Denver, who immediately recognized the forensic bust as resembling her former neighbor. She contacted America's Most Wanted, providing Clark's name and last known address. The producers forwarded the tip to the FBI. Investigators quickly located Robert Clark in Richmond, Virginia, where he had moved with his wife Dolores in 1988 after taking a job with a local accounting firm. On June 1, 1989, John List's 64th birthday, FBI agents and local police surrounded the accounting office where Robert Clark worked and arrested him as he sat at his desk, working on a client's taxes. John initially denied he was John List, insisting he was Robert Clark, and that this was a case of mistaken identity. But his fingerprints matched those on file for John Emil List, and the physical resemblance to the age-progressed bust was uncanny. John List had been found. Dolores Clark was devastated when she learned her husband's true identity. The man she had been married to for 12 years was not Bob Clark, but John List, a fugitive who had murdered his entire family. Dolores cooperated fully with authorities, providing information about John's life as Robert Clark and confirming that he had never shown any signs of violence or remorse. She divorced John and returned to using her maiden name, trying to rebuild her life after the shocking revelation. John List was extradited to New Jersey to stand trial for 5 counts of first-degree murder. His trial began in October 1990 in Union County Superior Court. The prosecution, led by Assistant Prosecutor Eleanor Clark, presented a straightforward case. John List had methodically planned and executed the murders of his entire family, then fled and lived under an assumed identity for 18 years. The physical evidence, the bodies, the ballistics, the confession letter, was overwhelming. Witnesses, including neighbors, former colleagues, and family members, testified about John's financial problems, his rigid religious beliefs, and his deteriorating mental state in the months before the murders. The defense, led by attorney Elijah Miller, argued that John List had suffered a mental breakdown and was not in his right mind when he committed the murders. They called psychiatrists who testified that John met the criteria for several mental illnesses, including depression and a delusional disorder that caused him to genuinely believe killing his family was an act of mercy that would save their souls. The defense did not dispute that John had killed his family. He had confessed to that, but argued that he should be found not guilty by reason of insanity. The most dramatic moments of the trial came when John List himself took the stand to testify in his own defense. Speaking in a calm, emotionless voice, John described in detail how he had killed each member of his family on November 9, 1971. He showed no tears, no visible remorse, no emotion of any kind. He explained his religious reasoning, that he had to kill his family to save them from damnation. He said he believed God would forgive him because his intentions had been pure, even if his actions were wrong. Under cross-examination, Prosecutor Clark challenged John's claims of religious justification. She pointed out that nowhere in Christian doctrine is there support for murdering one's family to save their souls. She noted that John had chosen to save himself by fleeing, rather than turning himself in and facing punishment, which contradicted his claimed willingness to sacrifice for his family's salvation. She asked John if he felt any remorse for what he had done. John's answer was chilling. "I feel bad that I had to do it, but I still believe it was the right thing to do given the circumstances." The jury deliberated for 5 hours before returning their verdict on April 12, 1990. Guilty on all 5 counts of first-degree murder. The jury had rejected the insanity defense, determining that John List knew what he was doing was wrong and had made a calculated choice to kill his family rather than face the consequences of his failures. Judge William Lee Wertheimer sentenced John to 5 consecutive life terms in prison, meaning John would die in prison with no possibility of parole. John List was transferred to the New Jersey State Prison in Trenton to begin serving his sentence. He was 64 years old. Prison records indicate that John was a model inmate who caused no trouble, followed all rules, and spent his time reading religious texts and attending chapel services. He gave occasional interviews to journalists and documentary producers, always maintaining that he had done what was necessary to save his family's souls, and that while he wished circumstances had been different, he didn't truly regret his actions. In 2002, at age 77, John List was interviewed by Connie Chung for a national television special. During the interview,
John was asked if he would like to say anything to the people who had loved his wife and children, the extended family members, the friends, the community members whose lives had been shattered by his actions. John's response was telling. "I understand they are angry with me, but I hope eventually they can understand that I did what I thought was best. I saved my family from a fate worse than death. I saved them from hell." This response encapsulates the profound pathology at the heart of John List's crimes. He had convinced himself so thoroughly of his own righteousness that even decades later, even after being convicted and imprisoned, he could not acknowledge the fundamental evil of what he had done. In his mind, he was not a murderer, but a martyr who had made the ultimate sacrifice: his freedom, his reputation, his earthly life, to ensure his family's eternal salvation. John Emil List died in prison on March 21, 2008, at age 82, from complications of pneumonia. He had spent his final 18 years behind bars, the same length of time he had spent as a free man after the murders. His body was cremated, and his ashes were not claimed by any family members. No one held a memorial service. John List died as he had lived his life after 1971, alone, unrepentant, and convinced of his own twisted moral superiority. The List case has become one of the most studied and analyzed family annihilator cases in American criminal history. Psychologists and criminologists point to it as a textbook example of how extreme religious rigidity, combined with narcissistic personality traits and financial desperation, can lead to catastrophic violence. John List could not admit failure, could not ask for help, could not accept that his family might survive and even thrive without him. His ego and his pathological need for control were so profound that he preferred to kill his family rather than allow them to witness his humiliation. The case also raises disturbing questions about the nature of evil and responsibility. Was John List mentally ill, suffering from delusions that genuinely altered his perception of reality? Or was he simply an evil man who made evil choices and then spent the rest of his life justifying those choices with religious rhetoric? The jury decided he was the latter, that John List was sane enough to know what he was doing was wrong and to plan carefully to avoid getting caught. But the question continues to haunt those who study the case. For the families and friends of Helen, Alma, Patricia, John Jr., and Frederick List, there has never been closure. The murders destroyed not just 5 lives but countless others. Siblings who lost brothers and sisters, friends who lost beloved companions, a community that lost its sense of safety. And the 18 years John spent as a fugitive added an additional layer of trauma. The knowledge that he was out there somewhere, living freely while his victims lay in their graves. The only small measure of justice came in 2008, when John List died in prison, ensuring he would never experience freedom again. But even that justice was incomplete. John had lived 36 years after murdering his family, had experienced a second marriage, had worked and lived and enjoyed the simple pleasures of daily life that he had denied to his wife and children. Patricia List died at 16, never experiencing college, career, marriage, or motherhood. John Jr. died at 13, never getting to grow up, fall in love, or pursue his dreams. Frederick died at 15, his potential forever unfulfilled. Helen died at 45, her life cut short by the man who had promised to love and cherish her. Alma died at 85, murdered by the son she had devoted her life to raising. These were the true victims of John List's monstrous selfishness. 5 people who did nothing to deserve the fate that befell them, who died because one man's pride and delusions were more important to him than their lives. The tragedy of the List case is not just the murders themselves, but the fact that they were entirely preventable.
If John had been willing to admit his failures, to ask for help from family or friends or social services, his family would have survived. They might have lost the mansion and had to live more modestly. They might have faced embarrassment and hardship, but they would have been alive. They would have had futures. Instead, John List chose murder, convinced himself it was an act of love, and spent the rest of his life hiding from justice both legally and morally. He is remembered today not as the devout Christian he believed himself to be, but as one of the most cold-blooded family annihilators in American history, a man who killed his family and then went to church the following Sunday under a new name, as if nothing had happened. The horror of the List case lies not in bloody spectacle or dramatic confrontation, but in the banal evil of a man who could murder 5 people on a Tuesday morning and be back at work as an accountant by Wednesday afternoon, having simply erased his past and moved on to a new life. John List's final confession, the 5-page letter he left for his pastor, reveals the depths of his delusion. He truly believed he was doing the right thing, and that, perhaps, is the most terrifying aspect of this case. The recognition that humans are capable of convincing themselves that the most monstrous acts are justified, even righteous, if the rationalization is strong enough. John List was not insane in the clinical sense. He was something far more disturbing. He was a sane man who chose evil, and then spent his life defending that choice. The ballroom at Breeze Knoll where John arranged his family's bodies is gone, destroyed in the fire that consumed the mansion. But the memory of what happened there remains, a reminder that evil can wear a suit and tie, go to church every Sunday, and present itself as moral and upstanding while planning the murder of innocent people. John List was a monster, but he was also a father, a husband, a son, and a member of a community. And that is perhaps the most unsettling lesson of this case. Monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like us.